The war in Ukraine continues to drag on, but poll after poll shows that the majority of people in the US and Europe want peace negotiations to have a diplomatic settlement. Most people do not want this war to continue. They do not want more violence. And yet the political leaders in Western governments are largely ignoring what their people say. The situation in Ukraine is quite desperate. It's really sad, honestly. It's kind of a meat grinder. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers fighting Russia is between 43 and 45. And as NATO continues to push Ukrainians into the cannon fire, the Ukrainian government itself is pushing policies that try to force Ukrainian refugees in other countries to go back to join the meat grinder. And the Ukrainian government has been talking about suspending diplomatic access, consular access to Ukrainians abroad. And there are videos that have gone viral on social media showing Ukrainians who are being forcibly conscripted, taken away from their crying mothers, and sent to the front lines where they're not likely to survive. So the situation is very desperate, and it's basically impossible for Ukraine to win this war, despite the many billions of dollars of support and military equipment it has gotten from the Western powers. And yet, despite that, Ukraine initiated a very strange operation in August, actually attacking Russia inside Russian territory, invading the region of Kursk and trying to take some territory. Ukraine has not been able to go very deep into Russia, but what this has actually done is it has divided Ukrainian forces and actually has weakened Ukraine and strengthened Russia's forces in the Donbass region, the separatist breakaway region that had historically been part of eastern Ukraine, but broke away and is now part of Russia. Now, this operation is so strange that even Western media outlets that are very pro-Ukraine and vehemently anti-Russian have published articles asking what exactly Ukraine is doing. I'm reading here an article from Euronews, which is a very pro-Ukrainian website. And it notes that, quote, while Ukrainian forces extend their control on Russian territory, Kiev's military is losing ground in the Donbass, end quote. Now, even they recognize that there's no way for Ukraine to militarily win this war. So instead, Euronews quoted a pro-Ukrainian military analyst who suspected that what Ukraine is doing is actually a political decision. This is not a military decision. I'm reading here from Euronews, quote, Ukraine's surprise offensive in Kursk raised eyebrows around the world, with its true purpose remaining something of a mystery, end quote. And then they cite this Finnish military analyst who said, quote, one of the explanations of this operation by the Ukrainians is to gain leverage because elections in the US are coming. A lot of partners and allies of Ukraine are maybe starting to push this idea of negotiations, and Ukraine wants to keep control over that process in case they are forced into negotiations, end quote. The ridiculous pundits on social media who claim that Putin must be so afraid because Ukraine is going to conquer Russia. That's absolutely childish. It's never going to happen. Even Ukraine's supporters, at least the serious ones, are acknowledging that this could be a bargaining chip, that Ukraine is trying to take some Russian territory for when it is inevitably forced into negotiations. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to look at recent polls that show that a majority of people in the West want diplomacy, want peace talks to finally end this war that has gone on for years now. In a previous report that I did, which I will link to in the description below, I looked at a poll from June that found that 94% of people in the United States want a negotiated settlement to end the war in Ukraine, and 88% of people in Western Europe want a negotiated settlement. Now, that poll was a little strange because the way that the question was asked allowed for multiple responses. So it was actually summing to more than 100%. Only 40% of people in the US opposed a negotiated settlement and 39% in Europe. But again, that poll was rather strange. So today I want to look at another study. This one was published in July that found once again that a majority of people in many European countries want to end the war in Ukraine through a negotiated settlement, through peace talks, although again, their governments are not actually supporting this. Now, this is according to a study that was published by the European Council on Foreign Relations, and this is one of the most mainstream think tanks in the EU. It is in fact funded by numerous governments in Europe. By the way, I should stress that the European Council on Foreign Relations is about as anti-Russian as an organization can get. It does not have a bone in its body that is remotely in any way sympathetic to Moscow. But that's why this study is interesting, because if you look at some of the findings, you can see that even from this biased source, as anti-Russian as it is, it acknowledges that across Europe, people are very divided, and many people want this war to end as soon as possible through peace talks. In one of the most interesting parts of the survey, Europeans were asked, what is the most likely outcome of the war? And you can see that in most countries, the majority of people said that the most likely outcome is Ukraine and Russia reaching a compromise settlement. In Greece, 49% of people said that. In Italy, 48%. In Spain, 45%. In Great Britain, 42%. In the Czech Republic, 44%. And you can also see that very, very few people actually think that Ukraine will win this war. In Greece, only 3% of people think that. In Italy, 3%. In Spain, only 7%. In the Netherlands, 8%. Great Britain, 8%. France, 9%. Germany, 9%. Basically, the only country outside of Ukraine where many people believe Ukraine will win the war is Estonia at 38%. Even in Poland, one of the most anti-Russian countries in Europe, only 20% believe Ukraine can win this war. I mean, because it's impossible. It's not going to happen. In fact, that's why even 30% of people in Ukraine acknowledge that the most likely outcome is a negotiated settlement, a compromise. However, that part of the survey was just asking Europeans what they thought the most likely outcome was. Another part of this poll asked, what should Europe do about the war in Ukraine? And you can see again that in many countries in Europe, a majority of people say, quote, if it was up to me, Europe should push Ukraine toward negotiating a peace deal with Russia. In Bulgaria, 61% of people say that. In Greece, 59%. In Italy, 57%. In the Czech Republic, 46%. In Switzerland, 42%. In Germany, 41%. In France, 36%. And the numbers continue dropping from there. But again, you can see that in some countries, it's the majority. And in general, in almost all countries, only a small minority of people say, quote, Europe should support Ukraine to fight to regain the territories occupied by Russia. It is only in 2 countries in Europe where a majority of people want Ukraine to keep fighting to retake territory from Russia. Those countries are Estonia and Sweden. Now, this survey shows that in some countries like Greece, they really want peace talks now. 59% of Greeks say Europe should push Ukraine toward negotiating a peace deal with Russia. Only 18% of Greeks want Ukraine to keep fighting to retake territory. In Italy, 57% of people say Europe should push Ukraine toward negotiating a peace deal. Only 18% want Ukraine to fight to take back territory. Of course, the most powerful countries in the EU are Germany and France. 36% of French want a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. Only 30% of people in France want Ukraine to fight to take back territory. And in Germany, the largest economy in the EU, 41% of Germans want a peace deal, and only 31% of Germans want Ukraine to keep fighting to take back territory. Now, what's also fascinating about this survey is it shows that in some countries in Europe, a majority of people think it's a bad idea to keep sending ammunition and weapons to Ukraine. In Bulgaria, a majority of people, 63%, say it's a bad idea. In Greece, 54% of people say it's a bad idea. In Italy, 53% say it's a bad idea. In the Czech Republic, 42% say it's a bad idea. In France, 34% say it's a bad idea. And in Germany, 40% say it's a bad idea. And largely in Eastern Europe, they say it's a good idea. So 74% in Estonia say it's a good idea to keep arming Ukraine, 66% in Sweden, 66% in Poland, and of course, Great Britain is always very hawkish. 59% of Brits think it's a good idea. Those are some of the main takeaways of this study that was published by the European Council on Foreign Relations in July. Again, I should stress this is a very anti-Russian organization, so that's why it's very interesting to see these results that acknowledge how extremely divided Europe is politically. But despite the fact that so many average people in the US and Europe want the war to end, it continues because Western government officials, who also are funded by the military-industrial complex, especially in the US, which is making billions of dollars in profits off of this war, they continue backing the conflict, egging on Ukraine, encouraging it to attack Russia inside Russian territory, to push its people into the meat grinder. And why is that? Well, the former British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, let the cat out of the bag. He said quite bluntly that if Ukraine loses this proxy war that NATO is waging against Russia, then it will be, quote, the end of Western hegemony. Here is that very revealing quote.
I'm afraid I have to ask once again, why the hell are we being so slow in giving those heroic Ukrainians the weapons they so desperately need? Because if Ukraine falls, it will be a catastrophe for the West. It will be the end of Western hegemony, and we will have no one to blame but ourselves.
I think that really says it all. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank you for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this, and I will see you all next time.